Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining to the session. Welcome to all of you. We're very happy to have you here in the Human Rights for Business deep dive today. It is happening within the framework of IDB Invest Sustainability Week. Thank you for joining today, for your interest. I'd like to start thanking our sponsor, the Minister of Economy and Finance from the government of Italy, who has made this training possible. And I would also like to thank and introduce you to our speakers today, Rafael Benque and Tamisa Gonzalez from Proactiva Results, who will be delivering the training today. I welcome you on behalf of ID Invest, and I want to tell you very briefly how to use interpretation in case you need it. You'll see a globe sign at the bottom of your screen where you can click and select the language of your preference. We have interpretation to Spanish and Portuguese. And finally, you can chat your further questions. And without further ado, I'll leave you to Rafael and Tamisa, to start the session. Thank you again.
Thank you very much, Domenica, for the introductions. Thank you for my colleague, Tamisa Gonzalez, to be with me, and all the Proactiva Results team to support the effort. Our sincere thanks to IDB Invest for this initiative, the sponsors, Ministry of Economy in Italy, and I think this is a session we put a lot of thought with the IDB Invest team on how to bring a snapshot of the human rights due diligence in a very short time span, in a way that this would be a leapfrog to you. So I think with that, we prepared a few slides, and let's put the slides on the screen so that we can start our presentation. So we are at the Sustainability Week 2024. Let's go to the next slide. And we are talking about human rights for business. The challenge is to speak on how to leapfrog in human rights due diligence with everything that is going on. And this is what we're going to talk about today. If we go to the next slide. Just to introduce ourselves, Proactiva Results is a consultancy firm working in Latin America for practically a decade, looking a lot on human rights due diligence, human rights impact assessment, as well as ESG parameters performance. We can go to the next slide. So I don't know if we have this in Menti, but we would like to have this idea with you of the participants, in what segment of work you are in, if business, academia, indigenous, traditional community. So if you can use this link and connect, and then later we'll see the results together. So if you can use either this QR code that is on your screen, or I don't know if we are also going to share a link through our chat so that we can know what is your main activity. So far we have a majority of business. So if you can use the QR code and answer what is your segment of work, that would be appreciated, so we have an idea of who is involved here in our discussions. Very good, the majority of business, but we're having interesting diversity of our participants. We have someone working with tourism in Jamaica. Very good. No one from indigenous traditional community. No business association so far. Very good. So we're having a good idea here. I think we can move forward. And please continue answer that. But I think we have a good idea here of the segments that are present. So what are human rights, and what is the human rights due diligence? So this is one of the major questions we would like to answer to you. For that, we're going to start with a short video that won't even reach 2 minutes, that will give you a full spectrum of what we're talking about, and then we'll dive into the subject. Okay, Luciana?
The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as well as the OECD guidelines, state that all businesses have a responsibility to respect human rights. To achieve this, companies should undertake the human rights due diligence. But what is human rights due diligence? It is a process that must be followed by all companies, regardless of their size or sector, that aims to ensure the management of risks, opportunities, and positive or adverse impacts in their operations, value chain, or that are related to their products and services. Human rights encompass a wide range of topics, including working conditions, health and safety, diversity and equity, and a clean and healthy environment. But how does this process work? First, companies must identify and assess the risks and impacts that they may cause or to which they contribute. Second, they must take appropriate action to prevent or mitigate the risks and impacts identified. Third, the company must monitor and evaluate the effectiveness of the actions taken. Finally, the company must communicate publicly and in an accessible way about how it is implementing due diligence in its operations and value chains, and about the identified risks and impacts that its activities may cause. All of these steps should be based on a public commitment by the company to respect human rights, preferably in a specific policy. In addition, companies should also provide structured communication channels to receive and address complaints and provide redress.
Great. So this snapshot through this video is intended to have a fast glance into what is the human rights due diligence, the whole context of how it is working. We saw the background of human rights being developed as a fundamental aspect, focus on people, focus on the human being, and on very basic rights that are universal, no matter what country we are in. These are universal principles and rights. And then the key question we want to bring in this training session is how these human rights, variety of human rights, correlate with the business, and how business can be diligent about it. So the first important concept is human rights and business will be what are the human rights that are related to business. And normally there is a tendency of understanding human rights very limited to working conditions. And we in business would think that only working conditions are related to business. And in reality, what we see in the relationship of business and human rights, especially when we are willing to bring forward this diligence approach, is that the span of rights is very ample. So we're talking about the right to life, health and security, including mental health, right to an adequate standard of living, privacy aspects, right to a clean, healthy, and sustainable environment, even climate change and the impacts of climate change on people are observed from a human rights standpoint, the freedom from forced displacement, and all the aspects related to land rights, freedom of speech, freedom of association, and so on. So it's a wide spectrum of dozens of points that have to be observed in the relationship of human rights and business. So with that, we have a further question to you that we are going to bring on Menti. And this, I think, is the next slide, if we have that ready. Let's see. So human rights risks, are they related only to working conditions, only to indigenous rights, or are they a variety and dozens of socioeconomic and environmental risks that are potentially impacting individuals and people? I think an important point we have to observe in this is the difference we have of human rights risk assessment and what is at stake when we're talking about business and human rights versus the traditional operational enterprise risk assessment. So normally when we're looking at the operational enterprise risk assessment, what is at center is the impact on companies' assets with financial collaterals, with disturbance of operations, even on social impacts, but we are not looking at the individual and people as a primary and centerpiece for the analysis of impact and risk. When we're talking about human rights risk assessment, this is what is at the center. People is what is at the center. In the individual is what is at the center. So I see the answer here. The overwhelming answer is well understood from what we started. We're not only talking about working conditions in business and human rights, not only indigenous rights, the relationship with indigenous rights. We're looking at these and further aspects as we saw earlier. Okay, so let's go further. So the first question is, and another question would be, is this new? Is this new, the relationship of business and human rights? Is this something new? And we brought this mosaic of related developments to corporate due diligence that have tackled different angles of different segments of business and human rights. From the very early initiative of the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises, where the responsible conduct for business was a major concern. Various aspects of human rights due diligence in different viewpoints brought forward by legislation. The milestone in 2011 of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, as we saw on the video, that really brought a landmark in terms of how we should compose the business and human rights, to the very latest developments of the so-called CSDDD, the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive in the EU, that promises to be and have a huge domino effect into mandatory requirements for due diligence in the corporate world related to human rights. So if we go further, we also see that in the next slide, we also see that all these developments were hand in hand being absorbed by many voluntary initiatives in the private sector. So we can mention specific certifications or initiatives that were bit by bit incorporating segments or the whole of the OECD guidelines or even of the UN Guiding Principles for business and human rights. So this is very important because we see the private sector already integrating and incorporating that irrespectively of mandatory legislation. And because of these voluntary initiatives, many times were sort of obligatory to market access, to financing, and so on. We see this practice already being engaged earlier and then increasingly in the latest years. So in the next slide, we emphasize that aspect who is watching and the stakeholders requirement. Of course, we have regulation and all these voluntary measures becoming mandatory. We saw the timeline of incorporation in legislation with the milestone of the approval of the CSDDD in Europe this year. But we see also sustainable companies as becoming more attractive to investors, or ESG and human rights becoming a precondition for financing. We see the respect for human rights and the environment as a condition for entering market, as we saw in the so-called EUDR, the European Union Deforestation Regulation. We also can observe requirements in supply chain, so clients asking for responsibility and due diligence over the supply chain so that they can buy certain products. And finally, the increased scrutiny from civil society. On the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the business case for human rights. Of course, firstly and foremost, we're talking about doing the right thing and caring about people and having a diligence so that we can care for very basic human rights. This is part of responsible business conduct. This eventually is also compliance with legal and voluntary human rights obligations. This is ensuring safety and security for investors as a consequence. Of course, this impacts on the social license to operate. And on a positive side, beyond not doing no harm, is also advancing sustainable development, foster business continuity and prosperous communities. It's important to highlight that over 90% of the sustainable development goals, the SDGs, are directly related to human rights. So when we are doing positive impact guided by SDGs, we are eventually also directly impacting human rights. So if we go further in the next slide, we would like then to have a snapshot of where companies are at on business and human rights. So I think this is a very interesting picture for us to remind what the video brought forward to us. So the human rights due diligence is different from an M&A due diligence. For that due diligence, we'll do in acquisition of an asset or in the incorporation of an asset, where we'll have a checklist and we have a product assessing what is that situation. The human rights due diligence is a process, a continuous process that needs to repeat itself time after time, exactly because the social and the human dynamic is also active. We have to constantly reassess. So this process of diligence, of care, needs to take place in a continuous basis. So we see this process starting, of course, with a baseline. We need to have a map of the critical issues, of the most so-called salient issues. This mapping needs to be assessed and prioritized according to the methodology brought forward by the UN Guiding Principles and good practices. Once we have this map and this priority matrix, we will work on a plan to respond to the risks, prevent risks, and also mitigate impacts. We will have a constant monitoring. We will communicate with that, with the public in general, and especially with the rights holders, with the impacted people or group. And it's very important that in this process, we have clarity around something that we spoke about earlier, which is who is at the center of our assessment. Our people, is the individual. So this is what drives the assessment. And therefore, it is very important that we engage with stakeholders, that we engage with rights holders. There is also a methodology to understand how we approach these rights holders and stakeholders in the adequate way so that we can call it a meaningful consultation. It is fundamental that we have a meaningful consultation in this process so that we can adequately identify and assess risks and impacts. Of course, as a system, this due diligence system, this ongoing due diligence system should be very well based on a public commitment, particularly on a specific policy or some normative of the company that would address specifically human rights, and also a very robust system for remediation and for grievance, right? So this is really fundamental as part of the system so that we can undertake a robust human rights due diligence. So having that as a background, if we go to the next slide, we are going to ask you a simple question that sometimes is also challenging and a shift in our angles, but particularly when we are talking about business and human rights. What is the human rights due diligence? Is it a process similar to continuous risk management, or a product similar to an M&A due diligence, right? And I think this is a fundamental point when we're talking about leapfrogging in human rights due diligence. This is a major leapfrog. If we understand what is the approach of human rights due diligence and how we should integrate that into our companies, this is a major leapfrog. A classical mistake, and I don't want to spoil the mystery of the answers, but I see things going in a good direction here. But normally there is some confusion, and people will ask to do a human rights due diligence as a product, right? And a checklist, and then that goes to the drawer, and nothing comes out of it. And what you want to establish is a continuous risk management approach, and a risk management approach that brings consequence to what was identified and assessed. Okay, so excellent answers. Let's go further. Let's go to the next slide. What I would like to ask you while we're going to explain here what Tamisa is going to bring to us in terms of data, but what I would like to ask you is that you use the chat for your questions. We are going to have a Q&A at the end. Our idea is to answer as many questions as possible, and if not, we're going to try to take note and answer later if possible. But please use the chat for our Q&A at the end. So Tammy is going to bring to us some information based on the human rights thermometer. This is a web-based tool that generates around 400 data points. Of course, Tammy is not going to bring analysis on all the 400 data points, but from these, she selected a few to reinforce some of the aspects we're talking about. On the next slide, I believe there is some. So the data she will bring is based on circa 480, a little over 480 responding companies from over 12 sectors. It's a good distribution in terms of sizing. About half of it are large, but we have a good component of mid-sized and also small-sized companies. And you can see that it's an interesting participation of various economic sectors. So that gives us a good idea of how the adherence to UN guiding principles, the OECD guidelines, and best practices internationally are going further. So again, this thermometer is a web-based tool that companies answer for their self-assessment. And through this answer, we have a baseline of what are the major gaps, major challenges for the company to be adherent to these references. So on the next slide. So I think here I can shift to you, Tammy, so that you speak a little bit the structure of the thermometer and what you bring further.
Of course. Hi, good afternoon, everyone. So as Rafael was saying before, the thermometer is a tool that addresses pivotal issues within a company's operations, its supply chain, and also its critical teams. So allow me to guide you through each one of these aspects, and I will give you some key insights and actionable steps for based on our data, on our collected data. But first, I wanted to highlight two things. We address supply chain and also critical teams. As Rafael was saying before, supply chain is one of the frontiers or the main issues now when we are talking about human rights due diligence, but also the critical teams that he was saying at the beginning of the presentation. It shows that it goes beyond only working conditions. So if we talk about decent work, so forced labor, modern slavery, child labor, living wage, equality, diversity, inclusion, mental health, environment and climate, such as climate, water, transparency and anti-corruption, and adverse impacts on local communities, indigenous people, and traditional communities as well. So thank you. So let's check some of the highlights of the 2024 Q1 results. I'm going to be addressing the main aspects when we are talking about human rights due diligence. So so we can, first things first, let's go through the Mentimeter, and if you guys can answer this, what is the best practice for a corporate public commitment in human rights? If it's the inclusion in the code of conduct, or if it's a specific human rights policy or instrument. Let's see the results. Okay, so the majority is going towards specific human rights policy or instrument. Perfect. Okay, so people are still answering it, but I think we can assume that most of you have already answered, and you are going towards the right direction, because even though the code of conduct can approach and can address human rights issues, the best international practice, it states that it's better if the company has a specific commitment regarding human rights. And based on our findings in the thermometer, we can see that an impressive 87% of companies, they express some level of commitment to uphold human rights, though only a quarter have a specific policy commitment. So, boom, if you can. Thank you. When it comes to identifying and assessing risks, either in the company's own operations or in its supply chain, we can see that over half of the companies have procedures to identify and assess human rights risks, but there is a gap in meaningful consultations, which affect individuals and groups. Therefore, it encompasses only 38% of the company who have a structured procedure, including meaningful consultations. As Rafael was saying before, here I must emphasize that when we are talking about identifying and assessing human rights risks, it is in fact people focused. Therefore, we have to have a meaningful consultation. Otherwise, we are not fulfilling this aspect when it comes to human rights due diligence, because as Rafael was saying before, this assessment is companies' assets versus people at the center. Okay, and regarding the responding companies, 58% have a systematic approach to identify the areas and suppliers with the greatest risks. We can see there is an effort to engage with the company's supply chains. However, most companies do not know how to embark suppliers into an actual and joint due diligence. This is why some companies, they have been implementing and applying these thermometers to their suppliers, so they can actually embark them in the due diligence process, and they can address what needs to be addressed. Next slide, please. When it comes to remedy and grievance mechanisms, internal and external reporting mechanisms exist in 66% and 74% of responding companies, respectively. However, only 31% of companies do not have developed plans to remedy adverse impacts on human rights. These figures there are even more concerning when they extend or focus to supply chains, where adherence to the human rights due diligence practice tends to be even lower than that. The urgency of this matter, especially when we are talking about supply chains, is underscored by increasing regulatory scrutiny worldwide, especially because a lot of different countries, they are developing and implementing regulations regarding it, such as the CSDDD. So, and also the legislation in the legislation in the European Union, the legislation in Germany, and there are a lot of other legislation that are being developed on right now, and also in the Americas, such as Brazil. So, next slide, please.
And
yeah.
I mean, just before we go to the highlights, I think what is important also to emphasize from this data that you're highlighting is that when you're doing like a fast assessment, for instance, using this tool we were talking about, or when you are doing really proper human rights due diligence, a fundamental point is the idea that no company will be perfect, right? Far from it. We see champions in different sectors that have very good adherence with great challenges in human rights. And the idea of this continuous process of due diligence is also the continuous effort of strengthening and better performance and developing the organization in having better and better conditions, be it in its structure, its practices, its governance, be it in really addressing people, listening to people, engaging with people to understand the substantive part properly, and put in place preventive measures to the risks that are identified, and also bringing a response to effective impacts that may be taking place. So the idea of development is very important. So for companies in general, when companies see numbers and see bad numbers, these may be concerning, and that's very good. But this should be concerning in order to, and this concern should actually be a fuel to drive action, because this is the main ambition and idea also of the due diligence, is how to improve. And in that context, the integration of the due diligence gives the tool for prioritization. And this prioritization is not the classical prioritization that we would use in a business risk matrix. The matrix that will be used is the business and human rights matrix, because we will have to prioritize what is relevant in terms of scope, scale, and remediability for human rights impacts, for impacts on people and in the individual. So it's very important that we take that in mind when we are prioritizing and when we are treating these challenges. So just keeping that in mind when we're seeing these figures and numbers. Okay, no, so now we can talk a little bit about the highlights for human rights due diligence implementation. Tammy, please stay with me to add, but just going quickly here so that we have some time for questions and answers. Please don't forget to use the chat for your questions and answers. So first thing, having a human rights policy or related instruments and translate them into practice. So we don't want just an instrument to be on our desks or beautiful on our websites, but actually to translate that into corporate culture and action. The starting point, as we were saying earlier, we need to have a baseline, we need to have a human rights risks and impacts map and have a matrix of prioritization, as I was saying earlier, following the best practices, the good practices internationally, the UN guiding principles, references, which in many aspects differ from the traditional corporate risk. So you need to understand what is this difference and make it happen in terms of the right approach for human rights risk assessment. The other aspect that Tamisa reinforced several times is the need for meaningful consultations, meaningful stakeholder engagement. The other very interesting point that we didn't tackle so much is that there is the so-called maturity assessment or gap assessment that a company should do. It is important to take in mind that human rights is not the work of one department. It's normally multidisciplinary. It involves several areas, several departments within the company, and the instruments for each of these areas have to be strong in order to encompass the human rights due diligence perspective. So be it the security department, the safety department, human resources, procurement, the social department, finance, all of them have aspects related to human rights. And when the company undertakes a gap assessment, it will understand how its governance, structure, policies are or not well placed to have adequate due diligence. The other aspect is supply chain. Increasingly, companies are being asked, we saw the evolution on that timeline, are being asked to bring the due diligence, the due care for human rights throughout its supply chain. So it is necessary to embark critical suppliers into risk mapping, into the overall due diligence and the management of this risk. So it is not sufficient just to take a command and control approach where we will put some provisions on contracts and leave it to the client to comply with it or not and suffer the consequences. What is seen as good practice is really to understand what are the suppliers that are in higher risk for several reasons, because of its activities, because of the geography where they are operating, build the understanding of what are the critical groups I have to treat with, the dependency of the company of specific groups of suppliers, and then with that, try to establish programs to embark these suppliers into the integration of this approach towards human rights due diligence. Fundamental, not only for companies, but also for the supply chains to have a strategic plan, have a roadmap, have a prevention and remediation plan in case of gaps assessed in the business and human rights management, have a plan to fill these gaps. And fundamental to treat the cultural aspect, the awareness, the training. There is a lot of misunderstanding, misconceptions around what is human rights and what is human rights due diligence. So really get the full force of people around the understanding of what it is. And as we were explaining earlier, the approach of continuous improvement. Okay, so the next slide. Challenges and opportunities. So, correlated to the points we were bringing earlier, big challenges and also an opportunity is to raise awareness and corporate culture. I saw earlier a question around the relevance of the board. We're going to talk about it soon to answer the question in the Q&A session. But if we don't have from the board to all employees a good understanding of what it means, we won't have that. As many other factors related to sustainability, we won't have that in the corporate culture. We won't move that forward. A fundamental challenge is the relationship of corporate enterprise operational risk management versus human rights risk management. And please don't get us wrong on this. We are not saying that they are enemies. The contrary, there is a huge opportunity in leveraging corporate risk management system, ERM systems, to leverage the human rights risk management. But we have to understand the different standpoints and make sure that this lever doesn't dilute what needs to be looked at adequately in terms of business and human rights. We spoke about the integration of the structure of human rights due diligence and remediation plans, the stakeholder engagement, the effective embark of critical suppliers in human rights due diligence. We spoke about this several times. And finally, documenting the human rights due diligence, because increasingly companies will be asked to show what they are doing effectively in terms of human rights due diligence. And then there are also guidelines and references on how this disclosure should be done. Not only guidelines, but also ratings, international ratings, looking at that, be it ratings related to public companies like MSCI that will take into consideration that, or ratings comparing different industries as the corporate human rights benchmark. Okay, we can move forward. Tammy, if you want to add anything, just jump in. And we are soon moving to questions, so don't hesitate in asking your questions. Huge opportunities in integrating human rights due diligence for several of the reasons we saw of what stakeholders are watching and where we are at in terms of the ramp up of the focus on human rights due diligence. But firstly and foremost, of course, avoid negative impact on people. But this brings front and center investor confidence, market opportunities, avoiding market restrictions, the strengthen stakeholder relationships with the impact on social license, risk mitigation, operational efficiency, and as we said earlier, the positive impacts on SDGs based on human rights evidence. So these are some of the opportunities from this effort. I think we can now move to questions and answers. So we hope you're enjoying so far what we're attempting to leapfrog. Certainly many specialists joined us, so sorry for going over things you already know, but we try to level the playing field on what is human rights due diligence and bring you some highlights of what is more important. Yeah, so I think one important aspect that was brought forward here by Monica was what role do we think the board should play in the management of human rights, right? What are the most impactful elements of boards that ensure best human rights practices? So there are certain elements that are really critical for business and human rights integration in a company. It is very important that the top level be involved, that human rights risks, the salient issues, be it risks or impacts, be visual by the board, by the C-level, that we have a good structure and a clear governance on how this information is shared within the company, how plans to respond, the consequence to what is being assessed is also monitored. When we talk about further to governance, when we talk about structure, it is very important that we have a focal point on human rights, on business and human rights, a desk on business and human rights, which will help to maintain the continuous process of human rights due diligence, integrate the various areas involved in the process, establish an internal commission or a committee to integrate the human rights perspective and monitor the implementation plans that will be pursued by different areas. All of that based on a policy and a framework. Some of these and the most critical aspects translated into KPIs. So a lot of what are good practices in terms of critical elements of sustainability we have to bring to human rights. There is a question about if we could share the report with the data. I think maybe Renato could help answer that or give some kind of channel where they can assess that or request for the report. I don't know how that would work. Maybe Renato could answer on the chat. There is another question. While I am looking at the questions and answers, we'll have an assessment soon of the training. There is here another question by Safia asking what position in a business would typically spearhead these initiatives? Also, what percentage of the work of a business would you estimate should be dedicated to these efforts? So very good questions, Safia. I think firstly, what area would spearhead these initiatives? This varies company to company. We've seen the sustainability area being the driving force. We've seen human rights, in some instances, legal. I think it really depends on understanding even the risk area. It really depends on assessing how the company functions and where it would be better placed to be able to really leverage the human rights due diligence. What percentage of the work of business would be dedicated to this effort? That's a very difficult one. And these probably would be answered after a proper assessment. So it's very important that the company undertakes a gap analysis, undertakes a salient issue, a risk assessment, so that it has its baseline, and from that, it will have a roadmap and understand better the resources it will need. There is another question here on how to start integration of human rights due diligence in the supply chain, how to select suppliers once it is impossible to embark all of them. That's a very, very good question. We tackled that briefly a little earlier. Really critical beyond my operations. And when we're talking about operations, is not only inside my fence, but also surrounding my area of influence. This is how I am looking at my operations, my direct, indirect, and linked impacts. That goes back to the reference. But in the supply chain, it is really fundamental to, first of all, map my risks, try to, as we were saying earlier, try to bring some criticality around groupings of suppliers and specific suppliers, so that they understand the human rights due diligence we're talking about here. This effort of establishing structure, governance, policies of understanding, having a gap assessment, of having a baseline of risks, and establishing their risk assessment for their own operations and to their respective supply chains, so that we really bring this domino effect. And as Tami was saying, this data of the thermometer, we see some companies using these type of tools really to bring knowledge and show to their suppliers where are their critical gaps, so that they start embarking on an agenda of more robust implementation, more than just assessing risks in a command and control approach. Tamisa, you have the hand raised, please.
Oh, yeah, I do. Actually, we missed one question. Monica asked, how far should in the value chain should investors go when conducting a human rights due diligence? So.
Yes, very good point. So I think the trend we have is that we would have to go to the origins of origins, right? So we had cases, and we spoke about the corporate sustainability due diligence directive. We had automakers in Germany, and it's important to say that the German law of due diligence in supply chain was a pioneer on what became, or an enhanced European legislation of the CS-DDD, in a rough analysis. But just to give you an example, we had automakers in Germany asking us to provide insights of human rights risks in metal mines, in mineral mines in Latin America, right? And we had top level of these automakers in Germany knowing the specifics of human rights risks, of the relationship with indigenous peoples in countries that many of us wouldn't even know about, right? That shows how far it goes in the due diligence. So if they are looking at how a mineral is being extracted, how many chain links do we have up to a car or a car part, right? So this is the trend we'll have for all sectors. And this is why, going back to an earlier question, it's very important to have a methodology on how to approach it. So that we are able to address this major challenge of supply chain. Tamisa, any other question? How can we, here is Juan Alejandro, how can we as a bank address the financing of projects where we estimate the client's environmental risks, but not those of their suppliers? So we are increasingly, Juan Alejandro, seeing banks adopting, and we see from different movements, First of all, the Equator principles, the principle for responsible investments have been incorporating a lot of these approach. In the CS Triple D at the last minute, the financing sector was not included, but irrespectively of these movements, we see a very straightforward move by the financing sector to incorporate human rights due diligence as a precondition for financing, and increasingly in the understanding of its portfolio, of its project financing, establishing prerequisites for different levels and types of risks. So the same way we were talking about how a company should address its supply chain, a bank could have that perspective on how to address its portfolio, its investments, what type of conditions it would bring forward, what are major destinations of its financing, so that for those that are of higher relevance and also of higher risk for several technical reasons, some prerequisites would be put forward, and that could go not only for the direct client itself, but how that client will establish the due diligence in their respective supply chain, as you're mentioning here. So we are coming to a close. We have just 3 minutes left. On the next slide, IDB Invest asked us to share with you this QR code, where anonymously you can share your views about this training for quality purposes. There are still questions that are not answered, but we hope we will have other opportunities like this to deepen your knowledge about the human rights due diligence. We hope this was in a very short time frame. We hope that this served the purpose of leapfrog your understanding around the human rights due diligence as a process for the corporate world to exert its survey, care, and diligence on human rights matters. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you, IDB Invest, for this initiative and for the partnership and inviting us for this training. And we hope you all have a fantastic Sustainability Week 2024 in Manaus. Thank you very much.
Thank you.